Formula One just spent years building the future, and in less than 3 races, it started to fall apart. We are talking about cars suddenly losing half their power on a straight, drivers saying they cannot push to the limit, and audiences dropping by nearly 50% in key markets almost overnight. But here is the part no one is saying clearly. This is not just a rough start. This is a system that might be fundamentally broken. Because the very rules designed to save Formula One are now putting its identity at risk. And what is happening behind closed doors right now could decide whether this era survives or completely collapses. Stay with me, because the real problem is much bigger than it looks. Subscribe now, because this changes everything. At first, it does not look like a disaster. That is what makes it so dangerous. The race begins. The lights go out. Cars launch, engines scream, everything feels normal. But then, slowly, something starts to feel different. Drivers are not pushing the same way. They are not diving late into corners. They are not taking the same risks. And you can see it, if you look closely. They are lifting earlier. Positioning the car more carefully. Thinking ahead, instead of reacting in the moment. And that is where everything begins to change. Because Formula One has always been about instinct. You see an opportunity, you take it. No hesitation. No second thought. But now, hesitation is everywhere. And here is the key detail. This hesitation is not a choice. It is built into the system. Because every driver now has to think about something that was never this critical before. Energy. Not just how fast you are, but how long you can stay fast. How much battery you have left. When it will run out. And what happens when it does. Because when that moment comes, the car does not warn you. It does not fade slowly. It just drops. Half the power, gone. In an instant. And imagine being right behind a car when that happens. You are flat out. Full commitment. And suddenly, the car ahead slows down. Not because of a mistake. Not because of damage. But because the system forced it. That is not racing. That is unpredictability. And unpredictability at this level is dangerous. But this is where it becomes even more serious. Because drivers are starting to adapt to that risk. They are leaving margins. They are avoiding certain moves. They are thinking twice before committing. And every time they do that, the intensity drops. Quietly. Almost invisibly. But you can feel it. The aggression is lower. The urgency is lower. And that leads to a question most people are not asking yet. If drivers are no longer pushing to the absolute limit, are we still watching Formula One at its true level? Or something controlled? Something restricted? Something different? But this is only one side of the story. Because while drivers are adapting on track, engineers are dealing with something even more complex behind the scenes. A system that behaves differently depending on tiny changes. Temperature, track layout, energy cycles, software decisions. Everything affects everything. And that creates a level of unpredictability that even teams are struggling to fully control. But here is where things get even more interesting. Because in Formula One, complexity is normal. What is not normal is when that complexity becomes visible. Because now, when something is slightly off, you do not lose a small amount of performance. You lose everything. For a moment. At the worst possible time. And that moment is enough to change a race. Or something much worse. But we are not at the most important part yet. Because all of this, the hesitation, the instability, the unpredictability, it leads to something much bigger. Something that goes beyond drivers and engineers. Something that affects the entire sport. And once you see it, you cannot ignore it. Because what is happening next is where the real trouble begins. Because once you step back, the problem becomes impossible to ignore. It is not just what is happening on track. It is how people are reacting to it. At first, it is subtle. You hear it in conversations. Fans asking questions that did not exist before. Why are drivers lifting so early? Why does one car suddenly slow down? Why does it feel like no one is pushing flat out anymore? And those questions matter. Because Formula One has always been simple at its core. Fast cars. Drivers on the limit. Clear battles. You do not need to understand the details to feel the excitement. But now, that clarity is fading. Because now, to understand what you are watching, you need context. You need to know about energy deployment, battery phases, recovery limits. And when a sport becomes harder to feel, it becomes easier to disconnect from. But here is where it becomes undeniable. The numbers. Because opinions can vary. Perception can be debated. But numbers are direct. And the numbers are dropping. Not slightly. Not gradually. Sharply. In some markets, nearly half the audience disappeared in just a few races. That is not random. That is a reaction. A response to something that no longer feels the same. But here is the part that makes this even more serious. This is happening at a time when Formula One should be stronger than ever. More global attention. More investment. More new fans. Everything was growing. Until now. And that creates a contradiction. How can a sport expand so fast and lose connection just as quickly? The answer is uncomfortable. Because growth raises expectations. And when those expectations are not met, the drop feels sharper, faster, more visible. But this is where the situation becomes even more complicated. Because not everyone wants the same solution. Some teams are pushing for urgent changes. They see the risks. They feel the instability. They want action. Immediately. Others are more cautious. Because they are competitive. Because they benefit from how things are. And in Formula One, success changes perspective. If you are winning, the system works. If you are losing, it needs fixing. And that creates tension. Constant. Political. Quiet, but powerful. Behind every decision. Behind every delay. Behind every proposal. And right in the middle of all of this is the governing body. Trying to balance everything at once. Safety. Performance. Competition. And the business side of the sport. Because this is no longer just about racing. It is about the future of Formula One as a product. And time is running out. Every race without improvement adds pressure. Every drop in audience adds urgency. Every driver complaint adds visibility. And eventually, all of that reaches a point where it cannot be managed quietly anymore. But here is the key detail. The fixes they are preparing? They are not revolutionary. They are controlled. Careful. Adjustments. Reduce power differences. Improve energy recovery. Add safety signals. Limit extreme behavior. All necessary. All important. But none of them change the core. And that is where the real question begins. Not whether Formula One can improve this, but whether it can improve it enough. Enough to bring back the feeling. Enough to restore confidence. Enough to stop the decline before it becomes something permanent. Because once a sport loses that connection with its audience, it does not come back easily. And Formula One knows that. That is why everything now is building toward one moment. One test. One opportunity to prove that this can still work. And what happens there will not just define this season. It will define what comes next. And this is where everything reaches a point that cannot be ignored anymore. Because all the tension, all the small warning signs, all the quiet reactions, they lead to one unavoidable reality. Formula One is running out of time. Not in years. Not even in a full season. In races. Because every race now is no longer just part of a championship. It is a test. A test of the rules. A test of the fixes. A test of whether this direction can actually work. And that changes how everything is judged. Every overtake matters more. Every strange moment stands out more. Every drop in intensity becomes more visible. Because people are no longer just watching. They are evaluating. But here is where it becomes even more critical. Because even if the sport improves slightly, even if the racing becomes better, there is something much harder to recover. Trust. Because once drivers lose confidence in the car, they never fully commit the same way again. They adapt. They protect themselves. They leave margins. And that changes the level of risk they are willing to take. Which changes the racing. But it does not stop there. Because once teams realize the system has limits, they stop chasing perfection. And start managing problems. Designing around weaknesses. Avoiding extremes. Optimizing safety instead of performance. And that shifts the entire engineering mindset. From pushing boundaries to controlling instability. But the biggest shift happens with the audience. Because once fans feel that something is off, they do not wait for explanations. They react. Quietly. They stop watching live. They skip sessions. They lose interest. And that is exactly what the numbers are starting to show. But here is the part that changes everything. Formula One cannot afford to lose that connection. Because this sport is not just built on speed. It is built on attention. On global interest. On the idea that every race is an event you cannot miss. And once that idea weakens, everything around it starts to weaken too. Sponsors. Manufacturers. Media. All of it depends on that connection staying strong. So now, the pressure is no longer internal. It is external. Visible. Growing. And impossible to ignore. Which brings everything to one decisive moment. The point where all these changes, all these adjustments, all this urgency, will be tested at once. Not in a meeting. Not in a press release. But on track. Because that is the only place that matters. And when that moment arrives, there will be no way to control the outcome. if the racing feels alive again, if drivers push without hesitation, if the cars behave the way they should, then maybe this becomes a recovery story. A difficult start that found its way. But if it does not, if the same problems remain, if the same questions come back immediately, then something much bigger happens. The narrative breaks. And once that happens, Formula One does not control the conversation anymore. The fans do. The drivers do. The world does. And that is the moment every sport tries to avoid. Because once perception turns, it spreads faster than any technical solution. And suddenly, this is no longer about fixing a regulation. It becomes about redefining the future. Because now the question is no longer technical. It is fundamental. Not how do we improve this, but should this have been done at all? And that question is the one Formula One has been trying to avoid from the beginning. But now, it cannot avoid it anymore. And now, we reach the part that defines everything. Because up to this moment, Formula One still has control. Control of the narrative. Control of the message. Control of how this story is being told. But that control is fragile. And it is about to be tested in the only place that matters. On track. Because no statement can hide what people see with their own eyes. No explanation can change how a race feels. No technical argument can replace emotion. And Formula One has always been about emotion. The sound. The speed. The intensity. That feeling that anything can happen at any moment. But now, that feeling is under pressure. And this is where the real danger appears. Because if the sport loses that emotional connection, even for a short time, it creates space. Space for doubt. Space for criticism. Space for something much worse. Indifference. And indifference is something Formula One has spent decades trying to avoid. Because controversy keeps people watching. Debate keeps people engaged. But indifference makes people leave. Quietly. Without coming back. And that is the line the sport is now approaching. Not a collapse. Not yet. But a shift. A slow movement away from what made it impossible to ignore. And here is the part that changes how you see everything. This situation was not caused by one mistake. It was not one decision. It was a chain. A series of choices that all made sense individually. Reduce costs. Attract new manufacturers. Promote sustainability. Modernize the image of the sport. Each decision, logical. Each step, justified. But together, they created something unexpected. A system that is too complex to feel natural. Too controlled to feel raw. Too different to feel familiar. And that is the contradiction at the heart of this crisis. Formula One tried to evolve, without losing its identity. But now, that identity is exactly what is at risk. And this is where the final question emerges. Not about power units. Not about aerodynamics. Not about regulations. But about purpose. What is Formula One supposed to be? The most advanced technology in motorsport? Or the most intense racing spectacle in the world? Because right now, it is trying to be both. And that balance is starting to break. But here is the final layer. The one everything builds toward. Because this is not just about what happens next. It is about what cannot be undone. The agreements are signed. The investments are made. The direction is set. And that means one thing. Even if Formula One wants to change, it cannot fully go back. It can only move forward. Adjusting. Adapting. Trying to find stability inside a system that was never fully stable. And that is why this moment matters more than any regulation change before it. Because this is not just a technical correction. It is a test of whether the sport can redefine itself, without losing what made it special. And the answer is coming. Not in a press conference. Not in a meeting. But in the only place that has ever truly mattered. When the lights go out. When the cars accelerate. When the drivers decide whether to trust what they are driving. Because in that moment, there is no hiding. No managing the narrative. No controlling perception. Only reality. And that reality will answer a question Formula One has been avoiding from the very beginning. Is this the future of the sport? Or the moment it went too far?